Hello, my name is Dr. Gary Simmons, and this is part 2 in the video series, The Integral Membership System. The Integral Membership System is a seamless path for moving first-timers into competent leadership. It's also a way in which we can create the infrastructure for our new funding model by bringing intentionally online the ways in which people can enter into a more authentic relationship, and especially with respect to financial ownership of the sustainability of our organization and what we're about as a mission-centric ministry. So there's also an opportunity to create more organizational complexity and bring online systems and infrastructure that bring into our organization, and especially in our efforts to evolve our church, greater structures of accountability. In other words, identifying specifically what is counted on when someone says yes to any specific role within the church, especially with respect to membership. So there are things that people say yes to with respect to the community member role, and there are things that people will say yes to with respect to governing membership as well. And so I've already talked about 3 things that community members will say yes to. They'll say yes to deepening their own spiritual practice, ideally through spirit groups, or just taking classes and other programs that we offer in church or they find on their own spiritual journey. The second thing they say yes to is some form of meaningful involvement and service within our organization or outside of it, and ideally through spirit groups, because spirit groups has a service component to it. And then the third thing that they say yes to is some form of designated minimum member contribution that is based upon their willingness to enter into the understanding of what it means to be in integrity with what are the needs of the church and where they are right now in their relationship to valuing what's going on, their experience of deepening that relationship. And so before we get into the specifics about how to engage people in the question, are you willing to say yes to a specific contribution, a specific level of beginning that relationship, I want to introduce some additional concepts that help us understand that nothing bad is going to happen when we have these conversations with those who are authentically in this intention to want to deepen their experience with respect to what's happening in our centers and in our spiritual communities. So it's only for us to have to get over our resistance to thinking that there's something out of integrity with our offering people a way in which they can engage in our community life in a very powerful and help us co-create a ministry that is going to be sustainable. So with that said, I'm wanting to present some concepts that will help us understand the different cultures within the church and make a distinction between those who are in the culture of receivership, where their primary value is just to belong, and those who are in the culture of ownership, which has in addition to that the value of owning the needs of the organization. So I'm going to begin to unfold that understanding so that when we actually get at understanding what is the realities of the various demographics within the church and their giving patterns, to invite people to be to come into an integrity with respect to what they believe is important in their relationship to the church. We're going to discover that that's not a too difficult proposition to move closer to understand that this is something that we can do. So right now you are looking at 3 congregations. I've taught this, used this metaphor in many of my trainings, and it's an opportunity for us to see that in any given church community there are 3 distinct cultures within that church, what I describe as 3 congregations. And so we have congregation A, which is the innermost circle, and typically that's the community or the relationship that's established in the relationship between the senior minister and the innermost circle, which is typically the board of trustees or your core council, as it's known in CSL churches sometimes. And then congregation B, of course, includes those who are in A, but those who are in B aren't necessarily in A. And congregation B could be described as the 20% of our community that provide the majority or 80% of the resources, or what we described as Pareto's principle. And then congregation C is the remaining 80% of the community that only provide 20%, or ostensibly just a smaller amount of what's needed to fund the overarching expenses of our ministry. And so as we look at these definitions, we can see that there are three distinct different cultures within the church. But there is a phenomenon associated with each of these cultures. With respect to Congregation C, it's important to know that there's a phenomenon associated with this community. And that phenomenon that many of us understand as, of course, the revolving door. And do you have one in your church? Every church has a revolving door. And it's especially apparent in times of not enough. And I know as I've served on boards and as I've talked about these issues with ministry leaders, it becomes more apparent that there is this revolving door when we're looking around and wondering why aren't these people still here? You know, we've often had the experience of having people come and get involved and feel energized and a part of us. Then all of a sudden we look around and wonder, where are they? And the reality is that they've moved on. Because here's the other side of the story, and this is what the trends support, and that is if the people in your church, in that group of that 80% that only provide the 20% of what's needed, if in that cultural dynamic, if those folks don't move into greater ownership, the statistics show that within 1 year there's a 90% turnover of those who are in the culture of receivership or Congregation C. Now, you don't notice a grand exodus of a majority of your people because people leave the system on their own, and it's just a matter of if you're in the culture of receivership, when you get what you have come for, you end up leaving. You've completed something, and then you move on. Unless you're invested in the organization as something that you want to partner with and help sustain. And so if we understand that those who aren't in the culture of ownership, and those who are by default just in the culture of receivership, without their moving into greater ownership, they're going to move on within a year, 90% of them. And so this is important for us to come to terms with, but it's not something that's broken, and it's not something that we need to fix. We just need to understand that there is the majority of the people within our community that aren't in ownership. And it's important for us not to put a lot of energy in trying to coax them to give more. Because the moment that we suggest that they're token with respect to what they do give, in honor of the offertory ritual that we have on Sundays, whenever we make that insufficient or not enough, it's going to trigger their own sense of not enough or shame, and they'll likely leave. And so as we understand that this is a phenomenon associated with what happens in the minister-centric model of ministry, especially in the context of Pareto's principle, where the majority of your people are in the culture of receivership, this is a phenomenon that just doesn't shift very much. It doesn't matter how large or small the church is, these numbers are sustained by the dynamic of our ministry practice. And I hope I can make that clear because it's a really important principle through all of this. So now what I'm wanting us to look at is a kind of way in which we can understand this in more concrete terms. So we talk about the culture of ownership. I mentioned about the culture of receivership. So now let's look at this and see the distinctiveness more vividly. So let's just imagine we have a ministry of 100 people and their annual budget is $100,000. That helps us with the math. And so we can just go through this little example by just imagining, okay, well, if we are looking at the culture of ownership or Congregation B, the 20% that provide 80% of the resources, how many people is that in this church of 100? Well, if we do the simple math, it's 20 people. And how much is their combined annual effort, their contribution towards the annual expenses of this ministry? It's $80,000. And what does that equate per person per year? It equates to $4,000 per person. Okay, and that's contrasted to the Congregation C, the culture of receivership. So how many people are in that culture in this hypothetical example? There are 80. And what is their annual contribution combined per year? It's $20,000. And when you divide 80 into $20,000 per year, what do you get per person per year? $250. Okay, and so here's important for us to realize there's something different going on with someone who is just putting what their pocket change is, which is works out to be about $5 if you average that out if they were attending every single Sunday, and somebody who is obviously their effort is so much different. And it's not better, it's just different. It's just to denote that there are different things happening. Now, those who are in congregation see their token or the fulfilling the ritual is not a tithe, it's not a spiritual practice, it's just what happens. It's a phenomenon in the culture of receivership. When you have a small group overfunction in the broader context of the whole underfunctions in the broader context of that smaller group. But the challenge is that we just can't even spread that all out because the nature of our ministry practice. Anyway, so as we understand that, yes, there is this phenomenon that produces this, what we have to contend with, and that is a small group of people providing the majority of resources, and therefore it seems as if the majority of these folks are an untapped resource. Yes, it is possible to bring those who are in Congregation C into greater ownership, and therefore our strategy for funding our ministry should be in the terms of getting those who are in the culture of receivership to upgrade, as opposed to trying to get more people to come to our church where they're automatically entering into their entry as into the culture of receivership, where there's this revolving door. That doesn't make much sense. We don't have to reach out. We have to have systems that embrace those who are coming brand new into our ministry and engage them into bringing them into our process of cultivating them. Because as they go through the community member process, they experience a depth of transformation that brings them into the desire to go deeper. And as we understand that desire carries with it a willingness to be present to the conversation, then why not invite them into understanding what it takes for our ministry to function? So the next step is in our understanding of just the dynamics between the two cultures, the culture of ownership and the culture of receivership, is to now be in the question, what if everyone in the ministry was doing their fair share in the context of what the need of the ministry is? And so as we look at this simple example, 100 congregants and $100,000, if everyone was doing their fair share, everyone would own $1,000 per person per year, and that equates to $19.23 per person per week, and as opposed to $5. So in a sense, can we not see that there is in this field of infinite possibilities the very tangible possibility that if everyone was doing their fair share, and at least in this simple example, the effort would be not so much extra that it would take to really underwrite the operations of the organization. But it's very difficult in the context of how we live in today's society to kind of think in those terms with respect to the possibilities. Instead, we reduce those possibilities to the realities that, well, you only have people of means, and then you have people who don't, and then you have people who are everywhere in between, and they have different relationships to the church. So how can we ever bring this ideal, this possibility into expression? Well, there's where we fail, is because we fail to move forward with the intent that all things are possible when we engage in the creative process in the context of fulfilling our purpose and passion. And so when we look at the possibility of 100% underwriting all the expenses of our organizations, we have to open ourselves to the reality that that is possible. It's just that we have to create the pathway to get there. So as we look at this example, we can see that if $19.23 per week per person is what, if everyone was being in integrity, that's what it would amount to, then we just simply ask the question, can you do $19.23 a week? And can we count on that? And so that becomes the spirit of that. That becomes the place to begin. What's important for us to realize is that those who are in the culture of receivership, those who ostensibly give approximately $250 a year, we don't notice them leaving the church because it doesn't affect the bottom line. I mean, if you can imagine just losing $250 here or $250 there, and over a course of time you have more people coming in, and their practice of the ritual of just placing their token in kind of makes up for that difference. And so we don't notice the fluctuations. And so one of the things that's important to realize that when it comes to asking a person whether or not they'll say yes to some form of minimum member contribution, let's say that in this example it's coming up with $80 a month or $20 a week, then there's only two ways that they can respond. They can either say yes and meet that minimum member contribution or more. Of course, we're going to allow them to add more to that if they are so inclined. But at the same time, the worst thing, it's not bad if they say no, because their no means that they'll leave, and they're going to leave anyway. And whenever someone is just there because they're just there, it's a drain on the organization energetically. And if someone is there and they're not going to be aligned with being in integrity with what it means to participate and be in ownership of what one is experiencing, then we should just release them anyway. It should be important for us to know that that's not our way. Our way is not to try to keep people in their relationship with us, especially if they're not going to be in ownership. So why not have a part of our process that brings that question into people's experience sooner than later? And as we understand that this is not a bad thing, and that people welcome this opportunity to be in this conversation, then we'll wonder why we have waited so long. And so the next thing that I'm wanting to be able to share with you is that as we look at the possibility of saying that those who aren't in ownership, if they can now be in that willingness to at least come up with their fair share, and in the context of what's already being demonstrated by those who are in ownership, now as we look at what's possible, we can see that the culture of ownership generates $80,000, and if that culture of receivership now owns their minimum member contribution, well, the potential is literally to increase another $80,000. And so without bringing in any more people and without asking people to give more, but simply be in integrity in their relationship to the church, can you not see how the income has increased? Of course you can. There it is in the slide. But this is just a hypothetical. Now we have to bring the possibility into some creative process where we make this happen. We allow this to come forth, because the principle with respect to the field of infinite possibilities is there is a way in that field to absolutely 100% underwrite through automatic electronic giving our entire operations, provided that our operations are in integrity. In other words, we can't just say, okay, this is how much we need, without there being an effort to really, without there being a reckoning, let us say, with what might be needing to be addressed. Because sometimes our current state has to be looked at in the context of feasibility and what's practical. So we may have to cut expenses, for instance, in order to be in greater integrity, in order to be able to call forth the integrity that we want people to be in. And this is important for us to own, because it's integral to our authenticity with respect to our partnering with the entire community. So there are levels of integrity and authenticity that we have to kind of move towards as we develop this idea. But as you can see, when we have everybody at least in the intention to be willing to open to the opportunity to be in integrity, the likelihood that they will say yes is very, very high. So the next thing I'm wanting to describe is not only how we calculate the minimum member contribution with respect to what is presented at the community member orientation meeting, but also to talk about the orientation process itself, because that's an important part of it. So as you imagine a community member meeting that's been scheduled, and then people are invited who are interested in community membership. And we have a brochure that describes our process of a community member and governing member and how people can meet the qualifications associated with each of those roles. And so the people who come are interested in belonging to the church. Remember, the community member role is with respect to the community, and it has little to do with the organization itself. So our emphasis and what we invite people to say yes to is all about deepening their relationship to their experience of the community, and ideally their experience in having their lives transformed. And so in addition to that, as I've mentioned, we ask them to say yes to a minimum member contribution, and that lives in the context of our community member orientation process. So people arrive, and that process is facilitated ideally by the ministry leaders as well as the board. And because this is a movement towards mission-centric ministry, we want to, as a ministry leader, step out of the role of being the kind of the one in charge of things, and let this be a community event where the community welcomes new members into the fellowship, so to speak. But right now, where we are, the Spiritual Center, our system is just now up and running its first cycle. We've been working on developing our community member process for the first 2 years of our tenure here at Unity Spiritual Center, and now the governing member role has went through its first cycle, and so I'll have more to say about that in part 3. But for now, in talking about the community member orientation, people show up after services, let's say, and the first part of it is welcoming them and inviting them to talk, each individual to share a bit about how they found our spiritual community and what is really moving in them with respect to their desire to cultivate a deeper sense of belonging and connection to our community. And so that's a very powerful connecting experience, and oftentimes people are already talking about their experience in spirit groups or their relationship with what's been happening thus far in their experience of the church. And so it's not uncommon that this becomes a very powerful, deepening experience for everyone. And then they are all presented with the 3 things that they are invited to say yes to. And these 3 things that they say yes to will be a part of an application process. In other words, at the conclusion of the governing member meeting or orientation meeting, they will be given an application that they can choose to fill out and return to us that completes their part of the process. And then after they've completed the application process, then we'll create a welcome ritual where they will be celebrated by the entire community. Suffice to say that after we talk about the 3 yeses, saying yes to deepening their spiritual practice, ideally through spirit groups, but we talk about all the other ways in which that can happen. Saying yes to some form of meaningful involvement, which includes some of the sacred service opportunities that we have ongoing at our center, some of the ownership opportunities that we have, as well as spirit groups, because, as I mentioned, of its service project component. Then we talk about the minimum member contribution. And so the slide that you're seeing now is a slide that we would use for this year when we do our community member orientation, because it changes from year to year. And so basically we invite people to consider what might be a starting place in their relationship with being in ownership with the financial component of what belonging is really all about. And so as you can see, our need for 2018 is projected to be $315,000 approximately, and divided by 200 congregants in our ministry, that equates to about $1,500 per year per person, and that precisely means about $131 per person. And so people are simply asked, if you can meet this minimum member contribution, that's our aim. We ask that you say yes to that. If you can do more than that, we invite you to do so, because there's often individuals where it is unfeasible or they are unable to meet this minimum member contribution. So we want to make everyone's effort equal insofar as beginning this whole process of conditioning the field insofar as do what you can. And so in that beginning relationship to the church, we invite people, just do what you can. Just tell us exactly what we can count on from you from month to month, and that'll be sufficient. And then they understand that we are inviting them, we're requesting them, that's a part of the qualification of their saying yes to becoming a community member, to make that contribution automatic. And we do so in a number of different ways. We of course have the traditional, we'll take your credit card information and we'll debit it each month. And we also know that people who do online banking can set up their own bill pay. But we're moving towards the convenience of a tithing app. Tithe.ly is the current platform that we're moving into, because it enables individuals to set up their own ongoing giving relationship to the church. They can cancel at any time. They can also compensate for the fees associated with whatever service is associated with the app, as well as to absorb the credit card and processing fees that are a part of that too. That when someone offers their credit card, we don't get the full donation, but this is an opportunity for our donors to compensate for that. And so it optimizes the ultimate gift that has been given. And so in their application process, they identify the activities that they've participated in thus far. They have identified the service opportunities that they've engaged in, and then they go ahead and fill out exactly what they're going to say yes to with respect to fulfilling that minimum member contribution. And as I've mentioned, our experience thus far at Unity Spiritual Center is that no one has failed to say yes to some designated and automatic form of contributing to the well-being of Unity Spiritual Center. Now, what we can count on with respect to having the community member role as a part of our broader integral membership system, once it's up and running, you would have community member orientation perhaps as often as every other month. But you're not asking people to become members. You place that as a part of your ministry practice, and people find out that there's a membership orientation, and so they come as they are drawn to it. You're not asking them to join the church. So that's a big shift out of the minister-centric ministry practice, because typically that's our way of trying to get people to give more. But when people are ready, they ask for information about membership and belonging to the church. Or let's say, for the sake of doing the simple math, let's say we have 20 people. So 10 people typically, in terms of just the averages that we've experienced thus far, will definitely meet the minimum contribution just as we put it forth. $131 per person. 10 people will do that. So we have 10 right in the middle that do it. 5 won't be able to do it, but 5 more will do twice as much. And so as you can see, if you just do the math, we'll be able to count on a significant increase each successive time that we conduct a community member orientation process. And then as you imagine the cumulative aspect of that, it's something to be counted on. And so as you imagine what is possible with the systematic orientation of bringing people into greater integrity with respect to their desire to belong and to value what it takes to be able to create the experience that they're having, there is little resistance to welcoming the information. The only hesitation is people evaluating, doing what they can, and we want them to take that seriously and put some thought into that. And so part 3 in this video series will look at the second phase of the integral membership system, the governing member role, and how that process has unfolded at Unity Spiritual Center and what's entailed with respect to bringing that online. And it's important in the onset for us to understand that as we move towards cultivating ownership, it's ultimately for the purpose of having our community being able to partner with us as ministry leaders. So their ownership is a part of how we partner with them with respect to our co-creating this new ministry practice that is far more sustainable in these ever-changing times.